Hi, this is Josh Kulp. This is the video for Daf Kuf Gimmel, page 103 of Masechet Ketubot. We are beginning on these dapim. You can see if you have a traditional Gemara in front of you that these are broad dapim with a lot of material on the Talmud part of it, not a lot of commentary, indeed almost no commentary from the Tosfot, and not even that much Rashi compared to how much text there are. If you're learning this from my Daf Shevui sheets, you can see just how much text we have to cover in such a short period of time in six sessions. And the reason is that these are agadot. These are legends, stories of the rabbis. The particular rabbi who is the focus is, of course, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, who, according to rabbinic tradition, was the leader of the rabbinic movement who organized the editing of the Mishnah and is really one of the most prominent figures in the entire rabbinic tradition. I wanted to talk briefly here about my approach and maybe a more modern approach to Agadah, to rabbinic legends and stories. By that term, here I'm specifically referring to stories about the rabbis, not recast stories about biblical figures, which I would classify more in the genre of Midrash. So let me go over very briefly some of the historical ways of understanding Agadah and basically answer the question, why is there so little commentary on Agadah? Traditional rabbis took these stories for the most part as literal truth. I think sometimes they were cognizant of the fact that there are exaggerations, that some of them are magical elements, and maybe some of these things didn't happen exactly as they were recorded. But for the most part, these rabbis traditionally through the medieval period took them as literal truth. As long as you could understand the words, it was very little reason for commentary. In the modern period, let's say the 19th century, rabbis and scholars really began to be interested in the history of the rabbinic movement, what actually happened. Since we do not have virtually any outside information about the rabbis, they had to mine Aggadic sources for what the lives of these rabbis were really like. And what they did was they basically looked at these types of Aggadot, stripped them of their more fantastical storytelling elements. However, it's not always so clear how you determine something is fantastical and embellishment and how something is realistic. But they basically would strip them down to their core and determine that whatever they saw as the core was the literal historical truth, meaning more or less that is who Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi actually was. And they, of course, would compare different Aggadot from different pieces of Gemaras from different places, and something that was verified in two Gemaras. For instance, the story that Rabbi Akiva didn't begin learning until he was 40 or later in life. If it appears in two different places, then it's more likely to be true. All sorts of historical techniques by which they could write actual rabbinic history, meaning a reconstruction of the events as they believe them to have occurred. Modern scholars, and I would include myself as one of them, a small part of that movement, would say, look, first of all, there's no reason to assume any of these stories are historically accurate or true. They might be, they might not be, but we have very little criteria by which we can determine what parts of a story actually happened in history and what parts are embellishment. Even things that are told in very plain, ordinary language without any mystical, magical elements to them may be inventions of a storyteller. And therefore have largely abandoned any hope of finding literal historical truth in these stories. And so what do they do with them anyway? Nevertheless, despite the fact that they don't find literal historical truth in these stories, they nevertheless have paid increasing amounts of attention to them because they've looked at them as literary stories. Just the same way we might analyze a Greek piece of literature or a fable or a medieval piece of literature or a modern short story, and the genre here is important. These stories tend to be short. They are certainly not novels. So too, we will analyze these kinds of stories. We'll look for things such as literary devices, alliteration, repetition of words, wordplay. We'll look for the dramatic meaning of the events, how the structure of the story. Is the first half of the story a foil for the second half of the story? Is there a chiastic order, meaning A, B, C, D, D, C, B, A, some kind of story order in the story like that? Are there repetitive themes? And then overall, what light does the story show on the lives of those who were creating it? What messages were they trying to impart? If we can't learn the history of the rabbis who are described in that story, maybe we can learn a little bit about the rabbis who composed those stories. So those are the kinds of questions that there is a chapter in my book, Reconstructing the Talmud, where we discuss them. Hopefully there'll be a chapter in a new forthcoming version. Those are the kinds of questions that interest me. I'm not going to have all that much time to get into them in this format, but there is a great, rich literature on it. Maybe one of the best books I could recommend is a book called Talmudic Stories by Professor Jeffrey Rubenstein of New York University. It's an excellent book where he analyzes 6 of the most famous Agadot, rabbinic legends in the entire Talmudic tradition.